Good afternoon, everyone. This is Eric Masten, Director of Public Policy. And to those of you not on the East Coast or Central time zones, good morning. I'd like to thank you for joining us for this webinar on Americans' awareness of youth homelessness. As I noted, I am the Director of Public Policy with the National Network for Youth. A couple of quick housekeeping items. All attendees are currently in listen-only mode. If you have questions, please use the toolbox on your screen to submit those through the chat. I would ask your patience as I am the only one running today's call, so I may be slightly delayed in responding to questions that come in electronically. Additionally, we should have some time for questions at the end. At that time, please go ahead and raise your hand, again using the toolbox, and we will go ahead and open your line because individually, owing to the number of participants currently on the call. This webinar will be recorded and made available after we conclude in the next day or so that you'll be able to share this information with your colleagues. As many of you know, the National Network for Youth is the nation's oldest youth organization dedicated to addressing, preventing, and responding to youth and young adult homelessness. Many of you are members of the network as runaway and homeless youth providers or as McKinney-Vento education liaisons in local communities. We're excited to have you all join us and hope that you find today's information helpful. So today we'll be covering a bit of the findings of a recent Ipsos poll conducted to evaluate Americans' awareness of youth and young adult homelessness. This poll was conducted by Ipsos, global market research and consulting firm. I'm sure many of you have heard of them. We commissioned this in support of and partnership with organizations that we were working with during and around the Street Child World Cup. As some of you may be aware, last year the National Network for Youth had the opportunity to facilitate a team of young girls who had experience with homelessness to participate in the Street Child World Cup as part of the activities surrounding the World Cup in Moscow, Russia last summer. The poll was conducted with a sample of approximately 1,500 adults over the age of 18. It was conducted online in English, and because of methodology associated with online polling, there's not a specific margin of error, but there are confidence intervals, and the responses were calibrated to model the characteristics representative of the United States. A little bit of the methodology issues there. Additionally, I will later ensure that you have available online links to more information, including link to the Ipsos report, which includes full methodology and tables from the poll for those of you who are particularly interested in drilling into the discrete data points. So what did Ipsos find after conducting this poll of Americans to understand their awareness? Well, they found that, generally speaking, Americans underestimate the number of youth and young adults who experience homelessness. But they did find that Americans believe that addressing youth and young adult homelessness is important. They believe that the government should prioritize and fund efforts to prevent and respond to youth and young adult homelessness. And they believe that couch surfers, those individuals who do not have a safe place to call home or return to, but who are staying temporarily with others from night to night, they believe that those individuals should be able to access public supports to help address their homelessness. So Ipsos asked a series of questions, and where possible, we've given as close to the full question that was asked. So this is one example there. In your opinion, among the 35 million young adults between ages 18 and 25, how many do you believe experience homelessness in a given year? As you can see from the table below, majority identified a number different than the 3.5 million young adults aged 18 through 24 inclusive who experience homelessness annually. Not quite a majority believe that it is a smaller number, either less than, somewhat less than 3 million. Only 13% appropriately placed it in the 3 to 4 million range. And particularly compelling as well from this is that 26% of Americans just didn't know how many young adults experience homelessness in a given year. We asked the same question of how many young people 13 through 17 of the 21 million of them in America experience homelessness in a given year. And again, we see that 26% of Americans didn't know how many of the nearly 700,000 youth aged 14 through 17 inclusive experience unaccompanied homelessness annually. Only 24%, similar to the number that correctly identified the range of young adults, also identified the correct range for those 13 through 17. One thing I will note, for those of you following along, looking at the fact that the brackets here are different, this was a case where in order to get the closest range, Ipsos worked to engineer the questions so the particular bands were different. And that was based on their expertise and advice regarding the number that was there, 3.5 compared to 700,000, and being able to try to get put in the same range there. So 700,000 falling somewhat between 500 and 1 million, 3.5 falling somewhat between 3 million and 4 million. So just a little bit of information on the methodology that resulted in some of those brackets looking different. Now, I've already referenced in both this slide and the preceding slide the total numbers, and we know that these numbers are higher because of the Voices of Youth count data. As many of you probably know, in 2017, the Voices of Youth Count Initiative at Chapin Hall at the University of Chicago released Missed Opportunities. The Missed Opportunities report what drew on implementation of the study on the incidence and prevalence of youth and young adult homelessness that was required under the 2008 Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. And through funding from the federal government to implement that prevalence study, along with additional funding, Voices of Youth Count conducted a nationally representative survey and determined that 4.2 million young people experience homelessness each year. 3.5 million young adults between the ages of 18 and 24 inclusive, and at least 700,000 minors between the ages of 14 and 17 inclusive experienced unaccompanied homelessness in a given year. One note on the methodology regarding the Chapin Hall data, the 700,000 is a household number because they were asking directly of experiences. They are not able to poll minors, so that was any minor in the household rather than a specific top-line number. The Voices of Youth count data, of course, finally gave us a true insight into the numbers, which have historically had a wide range on the total number of young people that experience homelessness in a given year. So we find it particularly compelling that the Ipsos poll findings show that, by and large, Americans still don't know the true impact of and true number of 4.2 million young people experiencing homelessness in a given year. What else did our Ipsos poll find? Well, as I mentioned, the poll found that a majority of Americans also just don't quite understand the nature of youth and young adult homelessness. When asked if the majority of individuals experiencing homelessness who have substance abuse or mental health issues had those issues before they experienced homelessness, a vast majority, 70% of Americans, believed that a majority of homeless people had substance abuse issues before experiencing homelessness, and 73% believed that a majority of those experiencing homelessness had already been experiencing mental health issues before they began experiencing homelessness. Now, what we know from data and experience, of course, is that particularly for young people, substance abuse and mental health issues largely stem from homelessness rather than directly contributing to it because the individual is struggling with substance abuse or mental health challenges. Of course, many young people will experience homelessness that is related to those, but that is often tied to broader family instability and those presenting within family members. So caregivers who might have substance abuse issues or mental health issues that end up causing instability in the home and lead a young person to begin experiencing homelessness, either through familial loss of housing or through a young person choosing to leave an unstable, unhealthy home situation. Additionally, we dove in the poll to what Americans believe about the impacts and how to address youth and young adult homelessness. And the poll found that 91% of those who were polled believed that dealing with the problem of youth homelessness is important. And 88% agreed that the success of young people has a direct impact on the success of our communities. Hopefully, this doesn't surprise anyone, but we do find it particularly compelling that when we look at the fact that 91% of Americans believe that addressing with youth homelessness is important, because so many of them also believe that young people have a direct impact on the success of their communities, it speaks to the value and importance of addressing, preventing, and responding to youth and young adult homelessness within individual communities and across the country, so that those young people can continue to contribute to their communities and transition successfully into adulthood. Specifically, Ipsos poll asked about support for prioritizing efforts to reduce youth homelessness. Over 80% of Americans, 82%, believed that state governments should prioritize efforts to reduce youth homelessness, and 81% think the federal government should do so as well. Of course, as many of you know, we see throughout communities and throughout the country the importance and impact that local communities have in identifying what homelessness looks like in their communities, especially for young people, identifying the key drivers for that within their communities, and working to develop local solutions that can be implemented successfully within their communities. But of course, none of that is helpful, none of that is going to be successful without federal support to prioritize efforts to reduce youth and young adult homelessness in providing communities with the tools and resources that they need to intervene. We additionally asked to drill into some of those specific questions and ideas around the types of supports that we know young people need about their Americans' opinions and support for governments providing funding for young people to finish school and find a job. We worked with Ipsos to identify these two components as being two of the most critical things that we know are important for young people to prevent homelessness and to leave an experience of homelessness as rapidly as possible once they do experience it. And 84% of Americans polled think that state governments should prioritize funding for programs that help young people finish school and find a job. And 83% think that the federal government should do so as well. Of course, we know that from the data that Chapin Hall developed and released in Missed Opportunities, that the largest risk factor for a young person to experience homelessness was lack of a high school diploma or college degree. Individuals without the completing secondary education were 340% more likely to experience homelessness than their peers who had completed secondary education. And we know that that, of course, sets the groundwork for young people to be able to get employment that is meaningful and helps them to maintain stability successfully in adulthood. Additionally, we asked what Americans feel about those young people who are couch surfing, who are able to find a way to have a roof over their beds or their heads, but who are still homeless. And 79% of Americans, so a similar number to other data for those articulating the need for prioritization and investments in resources, agree that young people who can find food and shelter by couch surfing should still be able to use public services providing food and shelter. Of course, we know from additional data and research, as well as years of experience, that young people who are couch surfing, who are homeless by almost every definition, save for one federal definition, are homeless, and they are particularly vulnerable. We know that young people, regardless of their age, and even those that are adults, can be just as, if not more vulnerable and at risk of any range of negative consequences if they are couch surfing or staying with others. And we find it compelling that 79% of Americans agree that anyone who is homeless should be able to access those public services. Whatever that looks like, of course, would be important to determine based on the needs of the individual. But Americans largely agree that those individuals need access to resources and supports. I'm going to pause at this point to give folks time to submit any questions that you may have regarding the findings from the poll before I move to talk a little bit about what we see as some of the implications and ways that individuals can use the information that this poll has given us. If you have any questions, please go ahead and submit them in the question box or in the chat box. If you are not online, you can go ahead and, if you are online but not able to type it in, you can also go ahead and utilize the toolbar to raise your hand to ask any questions, and we can go ahead and open your line individually. We have one question here. I'm going to go ahead and open the line to address this question. Lorena, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So based on the findings that, people think that the state and the federal government need to prioritize, I mean, what kind of, I know the figure to me doesn't, at least I guess what I'm trying to find out is how do we prioritize? How would this funding be used in trying to help them find, trying to get them back to school and trying to help them get a job? Like, how would we prioritize if we were to get more funding?
It's a great question, and can be a good segue actually into some of the next items. So I think there are two parts to that question. First and foremost is, I'm hearing two things. Number one, how can communities identify and prioritize on the ground? And by and large, that's an issue for communities to identify and develop based on identification of what local resources are available within a community. For instance, the National Network for Youth has identified our proposed system to prevent and end youth and young adult homelessness, which helps identify some of those supports that should be available throughout a community, including ways for educational completion and workforce skills building. But every community, we think, should be able to identify what the greatest needs in terms of resources in their community are, as well as how to get those resources connected to any individual that's experiencing homelessness, and particularly to make sure that they are connecting with the most vulnerable. Now, the other part of that question, I think, is what are the specific programs and supports that are out there? I will later share a link to the National Network for Youth Policy and Action page, which has information on a broad range of programs that we fight for federal funding for, which helps to flow down to communities or to individual programs, which are then able to use that funding to scale up other state and local funding, or to scale up and provide to help them secure other community supports, whether it's philanthropy or grants or individual contributions in their communities. What are some of those? Well, those could include funding for youth-targeted programs that provide shelter and services like the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act. Looking particularly at education, we know that the McKinney-Vento Education for Homeless Children and Youth Act, which provides funding for McKinney-Vento liaisons and services for schools around the country, is another key resource. As are funding for job training programs like those available through the Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act, through local community workforce boards. Funding for Department of Housing and Urban Development funding to local community continuums of care, which can provide housing for individuals and families, although we certainly see the need, and Americans clearly see the need for providing services to those who would not necessarily qualify for HUD COC programs. And also funding for programs that address other areas like preventing connections with the juvenile justice or even criminal justice systems. Both early prevention programs like mentoring grants, which are provided through the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, or funding that goes to states within their juvenile justice communities to help states implement their local juvenile justice programs. And I think one thing that's important to note when looking at what those resources resources are and how they can be available on the ground to local communities, is that there is already much collaboration going on throughout the country. We see that through ongoing partnerships between, say, a runaway and homeless youth provider and a local juvenile justice system to ensure that a young person who may be getting ready to transition out of juvenile detention does not end up experiencing homelessness while they exit out of that program. Or partnerships between a workforce investment board and other voices within the community, such as schools, to help reconnect individuals who may be looking for job training skills, but who also need to want to complete their GED, to be able to identify how WIOA funding that can support a young person can be used to help complete their secondary education. So we are seeing that throughout the country play out in local communities in response to both the needs of the individuals as well as the resources and needs within a given community. So how can organizations and individuals like you use these findings? Well, we've got a few things that we really think are critical. Number one is sharing information about these findings. We think that by showing these compelling findings of Americans' attitudes and awareness can really help to bolster support for youth and young adult homelessness and the work that so many of you are doing throughout your communities to prevent and respond to youth and young adult homelessness. Beyond helping to address the questions of awareness and sharing information about the true number of the 4.2 million young people that experience homelessness in a given year, these also help to demonstrate the broad support from Americans around the country for preventing and responding to youth and young adult homelessness and making sure that young people have the tools they need in order to be successful. So we ask you to share this information on your organization's website. If you do advocacy, share it in your advocacy materials. Use it when you're talking with others about youth homelessness. Much like we did here today, we think that there is a compelling case on the connections between both now knowing through Chapin Hall's data in Voices of Youth Count about the true scope of youth and young adult homelessness, and then identifying through these poll findings what Americans are really still aware of around what youth and young adult homelessness looks like throughout the nation. Share information on social media. We've included a bit.ly link there, which links to a number of sample posts for social media for Facebook and Twitter, as well as the custom graphics, which you saw earlier in the presentation here, which can help to drive traffic on social media. And use these numbers in press releases. You certainly don't need to be talking about a major national event or national issue like federal funding for youth and young adult homelessness to be able to utilize numbers to tie them into what things look like in your community. So if you are looking at new community programs to prevent and respond to youth and young adult homelessness, using this data, which talks about the broad support that Americans have for prioritizing addressing the issue and prioritizing funding, is a good way to tie into the bigger picture of the work that you're doing in your community to respond to youth and young adult homelessness. We've also included here a citation for citing the Ipsos poll data. And again, this information will be available through both a recording of the webinar following the conclusion, as well as the resources that are already available on the National Network for Youth's website. So what is a particular call to action as well? What does this call to us and say about the ways, similar to the question that was asked earlier, about how we can use this support to articulate for resources? Well, we think that the data here really shows the need and the way that broad support can be leveraged to call on state and local governments to take action to prevent and respond to youth and young adult homelessness. Specifically within the federal government and the federal opportunities, because we know that so much money comes from the federal government and then helps to drive local commitments and resources. We see two key things that this data speaks to in particular. First is increasing federal funding for programs like the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act and the Education for Homeless Children Youth Act. Those two bills provide funding for runaway and homeless youth programs, which partner throughout their communities for providing services for minors and for longer-term housing and services for young adults, and also conduct a lot of key partnerships with their local child welfare agencies, workforce developments, school systems, HUD program systems, and juvenile justice systems. The Education for Homeless Children and Youth Act, of course, provides that framework for how schools can help identify and prevent and respond to homelessness when young people are experiencing it. And these are just two examples among the many others that I mentioned earlier. We do have data available and more information on all federal funding for other critical programs like those that I mentioned earlier. These two, we understand, are particularly timely since the Federal Appropriations Committee and the U.S. House of Representatives may be taking some action in the near future. And to show what a real opportunity for continued and increased federal investment there is, as well as how that money is leveraged in communities around the country. Last federal fiscal year, Runaway and Homeless Youth Act program received only $127.42 million from the federal government to go to grantees around the country to provide basic center programs for minors, transitional living programs for older adults, and street outreach programs to connect to young people to help them to get connected with services, whether through RHY providers or through others. And the Education for Homeless Children and Youth Act was funded at only $93.5 million in the last fiscal year. We know from education data that the McKinney-Vento liaisons continue to identify increasing numbers of young people in public schools who experience homelessness. Numbers have continued to rise over the years. And the EHCY provides funding for around a quarter only of schools to help them connect and provide direct financial resources for young people for things like transportation, housing, and other supplies and resources when they are experiencing homelessness. We see those as two key ways that the federal government can continue to increase investments in efforts to support young people to make sure that they don't experience homelessness, or that when they do, they have the housing and services they need to be able to return to stability as soon as possible and remain housed and transition successfully into adulthood. One of the other key things that the Ipsos poll data particularly calls out through the nearly 80% support is we really believe that this speaks to the fact that Americans around the country understand what youth and young adult homelessness really looks like in their communities. And so we would encourage you to continue to support and utilize this data from the Ipsos poll in particular when articulating for passage of the Homeless Children and Youth Act. Some of you are probably familiar with HCYA. HCYA would ensure that HUD's more restrictive definition of homelessness is more closely aligned with the other 7 federal definitions of homelessness. When HUD's HEARth Act was passed 10 years ago in 2009, it created a more restrictive definition of homelessness than all of the other several federal programs that define homelessness, such as the Runaway and Homeless Youth Act, the Violence Against Women Act, the Education for Homeless Children and Youth Act, Healthcare for the Homeless Act, and a few others, which really focus on whether an individual, be it a young person or an adult, has a safe place to stay. The more restrictive definition in the HEARth Act has also been more narrowly implemented through HUD's rulemaking, as well as their annual funding announcements. The Homeless Children and Youth Act would ensure that anyone who is defined as homeless by any of those other 7 federal programs would be able to be assessed for services. And I should back up and be clear that where this definitional issue comes in is services available through the homeless assistance grants, which are administered in local communities through the Continuum of Care program. This would ensure that in order to access housing through a Continuum of Care program, an individual, regardless of how they're experiencing homelessness, if they are qualified under any of the 7 federal other definitions, would be able to be assessed for services and housing. And as I mentioned earlier, we know that individuals can be doubled up or staying in a motel that they're paying for or couch surfing and be more vulnerable than if they were experiencing a night of homelessness on the street. So what does not mandate prioritization would simply ensure that individuals are able to be assessed based on their vulnerability and based on availability of housing and services within a community. HCYA also does some additional things that look at greater data and reporting to ensure that all homelessness counts, such as those conducted through McKinney-Vento data, are factored into HUD's decision-making process and would also, beyond the annual point-in-time count, and would also ensure that communities are able to establish and identify priorities based on what homelessness looks like within their community, so that they're not being penalized for prioritizing evidence-based programs within their communities that may be seen at a national level as being a lower priority when a community can demonstrate a need and appropriate way to address that need. So, what other resources are there? Well, I mentioned earlier, would encourage folks to visit our website, and in a moment we'll be putting this information into the chat box so that you can have all of these links available. Our website includes a link to the poll, our blog post on it, which includes a link to the Ipsos poll via our press release. A link to that data is there at ipsos.com. And then I mentioned also some of the general advocacy resources available on NN4Y's website. I would encourage folks to look at that information and learn more about the specific policy solutions that the network is advocating for and that we hope you will join us in advocating for as well. I have also in the chat included a link to some of those custom graphics. I mentioned the bit.ly link earlier, so you can see that direct link to the sample social media posts and the infographics that we have generated on some of the specific points that stand out from this poll. With that, we are a little ahead of where I had thought we would be time-wise, but we have plenty of time available for questions. You can go ahead and submit a question through the toolbar, and we will go ahead and take that in. I'll give folks a moment to go ahead and type, or if you are better able to do so verbally, we can go ahead, if you raise your hand, we'll go ahead and open lines like we did previously. If you're having trouble submitting a question through the question system, you can also go ahead and do so through the chat. It looks like we have a couple of questions that have come in here. Those are going to be, bear with me here, will slides be available for copy? We will go ahead and make this webinar available. It has been recorded, and I believe that we'll go ahead and PDF the slides so that they will be available. Other question is, are there community level strategy suggestions? There are a number of suggestions. We have seen here at the network communities working in a range of ways to identify solutions and develop systems to identify and respond to homelessness to really help strengthen and improve that collaboration. Some activities have been out there, including the 100-day challenges. Of course, HUD has been funding the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Projects, which communities can access through their continuum of care. That funding is supposed to be targeted for communities to develop solutions to strengthen collaboration. I think that there continue to be opportunities for Youth Homelessness Demonstration Project to be strengthened. For instance, by improving waivers from the HUD stringent limits on services to those who don't meet their restrictive definition. So that's, I think, one example where we've seen some opportunity for even more innovation through the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Project. Additionally, we know that the communities are working to develop new systems and build on interest. The one thing that I would encourage folks to check out on the National Networks for Youth's website is information on our local cross-systems collaboratives. The network is going to be scaling up support for communities around the country to develop and enhance their local strategies to prevent and respond to youth and young adult homelessness. So there is information available on our website for the LCSCs, Local Cross Systems Collaboratives. It looks like the follow-up on this one on local level strategies was if there was anything particular on this that looks at sort of how to engage the public. That wasn't quite a area that we polled on. So the poll was more to understand general awareness levels, as well as to identify Americans' beliefs about the scope of and how to respond to the issues. I think, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, that these are really an opportunity to incorporate this data into local awareness building activities, whether that's doing things like a youth count. We know communities have done those to get a real handle on what youth and young adult homelessness looks like in their communities, as well as to help build awareness overall about youth and young adult homelessness. But this didn't dive specifically into communication strategies, but we have a number of those available that we have developed over time in working with communities. So I would encourage you to contact us through info@nn4youth.org. That's nn4youth.org. And we can help connect folks with potentially information on the local cross systems collaboratives, as well as community awareness building resources. Any other questions, either through raised hands or through the chat? You don't see any other additional questions coming in at this point. We will go ahead and keep the line open for a moment if folks have any additional questions that they would like to submit or raise their hand for. Otherwise, again, I would encourage folks to follow NN4Y on social media, either NN4Youth on Facebook and Twitter. I mentioned earlier some of the resources available on our website. That's nn4youth.org. And you can click on some of those direct links in the chat box to access some of that additional information right now, and several of those will take you directly to our website. Thank you, everyone, very much for your time. We really appreciate it. Again, we will keep the line open for a couple of minutes to see if folks have any other questions. Thank you, and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It looks like we have addressed any questions that have come in, and we do not have any additional hands raised to ask for the mic to be opened. With that, we will conclude today's webinar. Thank you all very much for your interest in this issue. We look forward to working with you to share additional information and utilize this poll to build additional awareness and to take action either through your own efforts or those of your colleagues and peers in your communities. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.